And we're starting off the list with Salisbury Prison in North Carolina. Salisbury Prison was a Confederate prison camp that began operation in 1861. First, the conditions in the prison weren't so bad. I mean, it was still a prison camp, so not an ideal place to spend your time, but not a complete nightmare either. There were roughly 120 Union soldiers housed there. They were fed decently and were given shelter, but that 120 inmates quickly grew to about 10,000 after only a few years. It comes as no surprise that the conditions at the camp severely dipped in quality. There was severe overcrowding. Many of them didn't have proper beds to sleep in. There wasn't enough food to feed everyone. Sanitation was bad. And this all led to the spread of disease and starvation. There was a high percentage of death amongst the prisoners. At number 9, we have Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City, Missouri. This prison operated between 1836 and 2004, and for a long time it was the oldest operating prison west of the Mississippi River. Because of some of the gruesome stuff that went on here, this prison garnered quite the reputation of becoming known as the bloodiest 47 acres in America. The building still stands today, and it's said to be haunted by the former inmates who lost their lives within its walls. In the early days of the prison, neglect and mistreatment by guards was commonplace. Inmates were whipped, sometimes for no reason at all, as well as enduring far harsher forms of torture. A number of executions took place within the prison, and violent riots resulted in the loss of life on more than one occasion. One of the most infamous prisoners at Missouri State Pen was James Earl Ray, who managed to escape from the prison by hiding in a box used to ship bread. And just a year after making his escape, he would shoot down Martin Luther King. Next on the list is the Wyoming Territorial Prison. Beginning operation in 1873, this prison started off hot with a horrible fire within that very same year. Great start. Within only a few years, the prison became overcrowded. This meant poor conditions for the inmates and an increase in violence. Things leveled out, though, by the 1880s. Conditions were still harsh. However, the prisoners had to remain silent at all times. They were referred to simply as their designated number, and endured harsh physical and psychological punishment for breaking the rules. The most famous prisoner here was Butch Cassidy, the notorious train and bank robber and leader of the gang known as the Wild Bunch in the Old West. Today, there are a number of ghosts said to haunt the building, which now stands as a historical site, including that of a former cigar maker named Julius Greenwald. Greenwald had landed himself in prison after shooting his wife, having discovered her working in a brothel. But he was in the brothel, so he wasn't going there to see his wife. A little hypocritical, if I might say. Greenwald died while serving time at the prison, and his spirit is said to still be trapped within the building. Some visitors claim to smell a faint aroma of cigars wafting through the empty halls. Number 7, Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. Established in 1829, it was one of the first penitentiaries in the United States, designed to implement the revolutionary Pennsylvania system. This system focused on solitary confinement and reformation through reflection and labor, but the conditions within the penitentiary were far from ideal. Inmates were subjected to prolonged isolation, confined to small cells with minimal human interaction, and this lack of social contact often led to severe psychological and emotional deterioration among the prisoners. The penitentiary's architecture, designed by John Haviland, featured a hub and spoke layout where cell blocks radiated from a central surveillance hub. This made monitoring inmates easier, but also resulted in harsh living conditions. Over time, the poor conditions and the negative effects of solitary confinement on mental health became more evident, and isolation and lack of proper medical care contributed to a decline in the inmates' well-being. Despite efforts to improve conditions, the penitentiary struggled to address the physical and mental toll on its prisoners, and it closed its doors in 1971. At number 6, we have the Maxwell Street Police Station. This Chicago police station was built in 1888 in response to the increase in violence and crime in the neighborhood, but over time the police force became just as brutal as the criminals they were supposed to be protecting the neighborhood against, and stories started coming out about the horrors that inmates housed in the cells at the station would endure. Inmates endured grueling torture at the amusement of the officers, and the station soon gained a pretty bad reputation, receiving some very unsettling nicknames like the Old Red Fortress, Bloody Maxwell, and the wickedest police station in the world, just to name a few. Number 5, Sing Sing Correctional Facility in New York. The first prison on the list that's actually still in operation. The land for the prison was purchased in 1825 in Mount Pleasant on the banks of the Hudson River. 100 inmates were transferred from Auburn Prison to this piece of land where they would begin construction on their new home. It was constructed from marble from a nearby quarry, and the prison operated using the Auburn system, meaning prisoners were forced to remain silent at all times and worked through the day performing intense physical labor. If rules were broken, harsh physical punishment would be inflicted on the inmates. And Sing Sing Prison became famous for its death row, housing the infamous death house where between 1891 and 1963, 614 executions took place with the electric chair. Things are definitely a lot better for the prison nowadays though. Still a prison, so I wouldn't want to go, but at least they're allowed to talk now. Next up on the list is San Quentin State Prison. Beginning operation in 1854, this was and still is one of the most dangerous prisons in the United States. It houses the only death row in the state of California. Executions used to be carried out through the gas chamber, but are now done through lethal injection. During its early years, San Quentin housed prisoners in deplorable conditions, with overcrowding and unsanitary facilities. The prison garnered a reputation for brutality, with reports of mistreatment, inmate violence, and harsh discipline. And the place has held some of the most notorious inmates in American history, like Charles Manson, and riots and violent incidents have erupted over the course of its operation. In at number 3, we have the West Virginia Penitentiary in Moundsville, West Virginia. With such a long and dark history, this place is known as one of the most haunted former prisons in the United States. Opening its doors in 1876, the prison operated for over a century before closing in 1995. Throughout its many years of operation, the penitentiary saw countless violent incidents, including riots and deadly clashes amongst inmates. The conditions were poor, often cramped and unsanitary, and the prison's most infamous feature was its use of the electric chair for executions, given the nickname Old Sparky, as well as hangings in its earlier days, which were often made public. With all the violence and death that took place within this ominous Gothic-style building during its operation, there are a number of reports of paranormal activity that have emerged over the years. The building still stands today and now has ghost tours with visitors and investigators reporting unsettling experiences during their visits. In at second place, we have Alcatraz. I'd put it at number 1, but this is a pretty heavily discussed haunted location, so I just thought that would be too obvious. I'm very cool because I'm a contrarian. Alcatraz, a rocky island located in San Francisco Bay, was first used for military purposes in the 1850s, housing soldiers and acting as a defensive stronghold. In 1934, it transitioned into a high-security prison, housing notorious criminals like Al Capone and George Machine Gun Kelly. Inmates here endured solitary confinement, demanding labor, and harsh punishment. Alcatraz gained a reputation for being an inescapable prison because of its isolated location and the frigid waters that surrounded it. Despite that though, there are several famous escape attempts from this prison, more so than most prisons to be honest, so I think they're kind of overcompensating with that. Over the years, a total of 14 escape attempts were made, with the 1962 attempt by Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers being probably the most famous. The escapees disappeared and were never found, and some say they actually may have made it to shore and were able to start a new life in secret. Others believe they might have drowned. Every other escape has been unsuccessful though, with prisoners being shot by guards while attempting to escape or just being caught before even making it that far. One prisoner in 1962, John Paul Scott, actually did manage to make it ashore, but he suffered from hypothermia and police found him unconscious. The building now stands as a museum, said to be haunted by the spirits of its former inmates. Visitors and staff claim to have experienced strange phenomena like hearing whispers in empty cells to even seeing full-on apparitions. And coming at number 1, we have Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus, Ohio. Yay, Ohio, my new favorite state. This penitentiary began operation in 1834, and just like every other institution on this list, its history is dark. It was home to hundreds of executions through hanging and the electric chair, but this place is probably most famous for a deadly fire that broke out in 1930. The fire was set off from a candle that ignited oily rags on the roof of the West Block, and it spread very quickly. Prisoners were pleading with guards to let them out of their cells, and some guards did help, but others just left them to burn. A group of prisoners managed to overpower a guard and retrieve his keys, using them to free other inmates, and pretty soon a massive riot started. Firefighters arrived on scene and were pelted with rocks for some reason. Fights broke out, and eventually the military was called in and the prison was completely surrounded. In the end, 322 inmates died, 230 were sent to the hospital, making this one of the deadliest fires/prison riots in North American history.
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have Jason Barnum. Jason Barnum, also known as Eyeball due to his tattooed right eye, is a figure who has gained notoriety for his life of crime and distinctive appearance. Born in Alaska, Barnum's life took a dark turn as he succumbed to a struggle with addiction and criminal activities. In 2012, Barnum's life of crime culminated in a series of events that would land him in a maximum security prison. He was involved in a string of burglaries, car thefts, and a shooting incident with the police that left an officer injured. His actions during this crime spree demonstrated a dangerous disregard for human life and the law. During his court proceedings, the judge, while acknowledging Barnum's difficult upbringing and struggles with addiction, sentenced him to 22 years in prison for his crimes. In our number 9 spot today, we have Alexander Pichushkin. Alexander Pichushkin is a figure of terror known by the spine-chilling epithet, the chessboard killer. His goal, as horrifying as it was unique, was to take a life for each space on a chessboard, a total of 64 individuals. This chilling ambition set him apart from other criminals and made him a feared figure not only in his operating base of Moscow, but also around the world. Alexander's reign of terror was marked by a level of brutality that left a trail of carnage in his wake. His victims were not merely killed, they were subjected to violent deaths that really showed the depth of his ruthlessness. The authorities eventually convicted him for 48 killings. However, Pichushkin himself claims a higher count, insisting that his total stands at 60 victims. Whether this claim is the truth or an attempt to inflate his notoriety remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that the sheer scale of his crimes, coupled with his terrifying goal, makes him a figure of dread. His chilling ambition and the brutal reality of his crimes make Alexander Pichushkin a prisoner whose release would be a nightmare come true. In our number 8 spot today, we have Richard Lee McNair. Richard Lee McNair is a name that has become synonymous with cunning escapes and audacious evasion. Convicted for killering and burglary in the 80s, McNair's story took a turn for the extraordinary when he demonstrated a knack for escaping prison. Not once, but 3 times. His most infamous escape was from a maximum security prison in Louisiana in 2006. In a plot that seemed straight out of a Hollywood movie, McNair slipped out of the prison work detail by mailing himself out of the prison in a crate. Once outside, he managed to evade capture for over a year, leading authorities on a nationwide manhunt. McNair's ability to charm and deceive, coupled with his physical fitness, made him a formidable fugitive. His escapes and subsequent recaptures were widely covered in the media, earning him a reputation as a real-life escape artist. Finally captured in Canada in 2007, McNair is now held in the Supermax prison ADX Florence in Colorado. His story serves as a chilling reminder of the lengths some prisoners will go to regain their freedom. Richard Lee McNair is undoubtedly a figure you pray never escapes again. In our number 7 spot today, we have Terry Nichols. Terry Nichols is a name that sends chills down the spine of anyone familiar with the horrific Oklahoma City bombing. Nichols, along with his accomplice Timothy McVeigh, orchestrated one of the deadliest acts of domestic terror in U.S. history. On April 19, 1995, a truck exploded outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, killing 168 people and injuring hundreds more. Nichols, a former army buddy of McVeigh's, was deeply involved in the planning and preparation of the attack. His anti-government sentiments and extremist beliefs fueled his participation in this act of terror. Following the attack, Nichols was quickly apprehended and brought to justice. In a trial that gripped the nation, Nichols was convicted of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, as well as other charges relating to the seriousness of his crimes. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and is currently held in the ADX Florence maximum security prison in Colorado, the same one we just talked about. In our number 6 spot today, we have Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway is a name that evokes a chilling sense of dread and is notoriously known as the Green River Killer. This ominous moniker stems from his gruesome modus operandi, which involved leaving the bodies of his victims along the Green River in Washington. The river, once a symbol of natural beauty, became a grim reminder of Ridgway's merciless killing spree. Ridgway's crimes were not sporadic instances of violence, but a series of premeditated killings that made him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Officially, he was convicted of 49 crimes, but the actual number of his victims is believed to be at least double that count. What made Ridgway even more terrifying was not just the scale of his crimes, but also his attitude towards them. In a chilling display of lack of empathy, Ridgway confessed his crimes without any visible signs of emotion or remorse. This cold-blooded confession provided a terrifying insight into the mind of a remorseless killer, revealing a man devoid of any empathy or guilt for his heinous actions. The enormity of his crimes, coupled with his emotionless demeanor, makes Gary Ridgway a prisoner whose release would be a horrifying prospect. His chilling legacy continues to haunt those familiar with his story, making him a figure whose freedom is preyed against. In our number 5 spot today, we have Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader is more widely recognized by his chilling moniker BTK, an abbreviation which disturbingly describes his preferred method of killing. Rader's reign of terror spanned over 17 years in Wichita, Kansas, a time during which he took a perverse pleasure in his horrific acts, savoring the terror he instilled in the hearts of residents. Rader wasn't merely a man who committed heinous crimes, he was a sadist who reveled in his victims' suffering and the dread he inspired. His chilling letters to the police, where he arrogantly flaunted his crimes, added an extra layer of psychological terror to his spree. The letters served as a chilling reminder of his presence, keeping the community in a constant state of fear and uncertainty. These communications revealed a deeply disturbed mind, one that was not just content with the physical act of his horrific crimes, but also sought to manipulate and terrorize an entire community. Rader's pleasure in his cruel actions, his taunting letters, and the psychological torment he subjected Wichita to make the thought of this man walking free a very unsettling prospect, and one that will probably never come true, thankfully. In our number 4 spot today, we have Cleophas Prince Jr. In the shadowy realm of San Diego's suburban streets lurked a menacing phantom during the 1990s. Cleophas Prince Jr., at the time known as the Claremont Killer, turned the 90s into a real-life horror show. Over 9 dreadful months, he embarked on a relentless hunt, marking women as his prey in the seemingly serene Claremont neighborhood. To do this, he would either break into their homes when they least expected it, or sweet-talk them into some quiet, out-of-the-way spot. During his reign of terror, while the local news was all over it, the rest of the world hardly blinked. During this time, the stage of national and international press was captivated by other monstrous players such as Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy, which casted a horrific shadow that eclipsed the terrifying exploits of Cleophas. Thankfully, however, in September 1990, thanks to some top-notch detective work and breakthroughs in forensic science, they finally pinned the tail on the donkey. Cleophas Prince Jr., Mr. Claremont Killer himself, got nabbed. The courts threw the book at him, and now he is chillin' behind bars for the rest of his days. No parole, no second chances. In our number 3 spot today, we have Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Also known as the Padrino Matador, he is a Brazilian serial killer who is believed to have killed over 70 people, mostly other criminals, in the 1960s and the 1970s. He had a very difficult childhood, as his father was a notorious criminal who actually really sadly harmed and killed his mother, and this of course had a profound influence on Pedro and his life. This experience is believed to have contributed to his violent behavior later in life. Pedro began his crime spree at a super young age, and he started with a horrific crime when he killed the vice mayor of his town, who he believed was responsible for the death of his girlfriend. He continued to kill other criminals, often targeting those who had previously wronged him or his family. Pedro was arrested in 1973 and was eventually convicted of killing 71 people. He is currently serving a prison sentence in Brazil and is known for his outspoken and unrepentant attitude towards his crimes. While I am sure we can all feel sympathy for the things that Pedro experienced in life, it truly is no excuse for the things that he chose to do. In our number 2 spot today we have Charles Ng. Charles Ng is a name that will send chills down the spine, and he was a key player in the reign of terror that unfolded in the 1980s. Alongside his equally terrifying accomplice Leonard Lake, Ng played a significant role in a series of crimes that remain etched into the annals of criminal history for their sheer depravity and cruelty. The grim saga began when Ng and Lake joined forces to unleash a wave of horror that would haunt their victims and the public alike. Their modus operandi was chilling. Unsuspecting individuals would be lured into their grasp only to be subjected to unimaginable torture, their final moments filled with fear and agony. What made their reign of terror even more horrifying was the duo's penchant for recording their despicable acts. These videos served as a chilling testament to their inhumanity, a grotesque spectacle of their victims suffering under their hands. Ng's role in these crimes was not that of a mere spectator. He was a very active participant, his cold-blooded nature making him a figure of dread. This, combined with his seeming indifference to the pain and suffering of his victims, made him one of the most feared inmates in the prison system. His heinous acts have left a dark stain on his name, making Charles Ng a prisoner that many pray to never see free again. And finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, a figure shrouded in infamy and widely recognized by his chilling moniker, the Son of Sam. He struck fear into the heart of New York City in the late 1970s. His name became synonymous with a wave of terror that swept through the city as he embarked on a series of shootings that left the public in a state of constant fear and uncertainty. Berkowitz's crimes were not random acts of violence. They were methodically planned and executed with a chilling precision that left the authorities baffled and the public on edge. Each attack added to the growing panic, creating an atmosphere of dread that permeated the city. But it wasn't just his crimes that made Berkowitz a figure of terror. His claims of demonic possession added a layer of horror to his already frightening persona. These claims, whether true or the product of a deranged mind, painted a picture of a man under the influence of dark forces, making him an even more unsettling figure. The combination of his heinous crimes, alleged demonic possession, and erratic behavior made him a prisoner that one would fervently pray never walks free again.
Starting us off in the number 10 spot is Cell Block D. One of the most well-known prisons in history is the island penitentiary of Alcatraz, and although much of what went on there was horrific, Cell Block D was where some of the most cruel tortures took place. Cell Block D, often referred to as the Hole, held the solitary confinement cells and was reserved for the most poorly behaved inmates. There were 5 cells in the area, each freezing cold, and prisoners forced to these confines would be required to strip naked and would only get a small mattress to sleep on at night. Then during the day, the mattress was removed and they were left in a cold and empty room to suffer. One cell in particular, however, was viewed as the most feared, as on top of the others, it was also pitch black with only a hole in the floor for them to relieve themselves. But during the 1940s is when it became truly terrifying. One day an inmate was sent to the pitch black cell and immediately began screaming as soon as he was locked in. But the guards ignored him, as they were used to such things happening. However, to their horror, the next morning they found the inmate dead inside the cell with a terrified look plastered across his face. What's even stranger is that the autopsy revealed he had died of strangulation that in no way could have been self-inflicted. Whoever or whatever took his life was never figured out, out. But every other prisoner or guard alike that has set foot in the cell says the same thing. They wish they never had. Coming in at number 9, a nurse's story. One prison nurse named KLC223 posted to Reddit revealing the most terrifying thing that ever happened to them on the job. Quote, sometimes severely aggressive or mentally unstable inmates were placed in the chair. It's basically a big black chair that after the inmate is handcuffed, legs and feet, he is then tied to this chair to contain them. Because this risks their circulation being cut off, a nurse was required to be present to check pulses every 15 minutes in hands and feet. They were let out of the chair every 2 hours for a 15-minute period to walk around the cell. She then goes on to explain one inmate who was very combative and who officers decided a chair would be required. Quote, the 2-hour time frame was reached to let him out to walk the cell. As soon as he had his handcuffs unlocked, he went completely insane, biting the officers in the arms and shoulders and headbutting them as well as punching them in the face. I had to run out of the cell and back off as quickly as I could. I managed to get out fine, but the officers had to restrain him immediately again. All 5 had to go to the hospital for either broken bones, stitches, or chunks bitten out of their arms. It was all pretty horrific. Coming in at number 8, Rikers Island. Even though I know intellectually that there is lots of corruption inside the prison system, sometimes I am still shocked at just how messed up it all can be. Particularly when it comes to treating the inmates as if they're some kind of pawn in a game. Back in 2008, 3 inmates were charged with the manslaughter of fellow Rikers Island prisoner Christopher Robinson, allegedly pummeling him to death because he refused to join a fight club. But the worst part of this entire ordeal is that the fight club in question was supervised by correctional officers. Apparently 3 guards oversaw a scheme that was referred to as the program and have been accused of ordering inmate enforcers called the team to beat up other detainees. So it's not just that the 18-year-old Robinson refused to be a part of a fight club amongst inmates, he refused to have a part in a guard-run fight ring, and sadly he lost his life because of it. It's honestly so beyond messed up that this kind of stuff is happening. Next up at number 7, Chow Room. So this one is definitely not the most cruel or barbaric one on the list, but it is definitely one of the more gross ones. Reddit user A Fake Fox posted talking about the wildest thing they saw while doing time, and I'm actually speechless. Quote, there was a woman there who had tried to take out her own mother, so as revenge, while the mother was escaping, she ran her over, put it in reverse, floored it back over her again, and finally put it in drive over her one last time. But the gross part comes next. Quote, the daughter would always have her arms inside her shirt. You'd only see her arms when she was sitting, like eating or something. She's across from me one day eating, and I see her drop a pile of something. I immediately was like, what the F? You can't have this stuff in the chow hall. What is this girl doing? It was kind of loud when she dropped it, so it wasn't laundry. It looked kind of like meat. How and why does she have meat? We're eating spaghetti right now. Then it occurred to Reddit friend, it was her intestines and guts that had fallen out of the woman. Apparently they continued to fall on the floor and she kept attempting to gather them up and put them back in her torso. I mean, I'm a little speechless, I won't lie. I hope this woman was taken to surgery? How was she alive? Next up at number 6, the Mamertine. The Romans were well known to be powerful, dangerous, and unafraid to kill off anyone who crossed their path. So it is probably not a huge shock that in the ancient world, the Romans also built and ran the most brutal prison of their time. The Mamertine was created sometime between 640 and 616 BC and was the only detention facility in the city at the time. While I can imagine that the entire prison was filled with incredibly cruel and awful torture, most of the horror stories derive from the lower room of the facility called the Tullianum. The Tullianum was located in a sewer system below the city and was designed for the criminals set to be executed, compared to the upper levels which were reserved for inmates. The sewer floor, which was located 12 feet underground, made for incredibly dangerous and hazardous living for the prisoners as they were left down there with no food or water until the fateful day of their hanging. However, sometimes if the crime was seen as especially bad, they would leave prisoners down in the Tullianum until they starved to death in the feces-infested dark pit. To make matters worse, it's also said that guards would usually toss dead bodies down there. I mean, it just sounds like maybe the most disgusting embarrassing situation to be forced into for your last few days on Earth. Coming in at number 5, a taser. According to one Reddit user, NDR Dog, who spent time in a prison earlier on in their life, the most insane dark thing that they saw was the treatment of one inmate in particular. Quote, "While I was being processed, one of the inmates was screaming non-stop about suing everyone and making the cops his B. He was still very under the influence. All the cops were generally laughing about it until one decided that it needed to stop, so they all suited up and went in to shut him up. They were more jacked than any high school football team I've ever seen. Off they went, and about 3 minutes later, silence. They walked me by his cell on the way to my new room, and he was just sitting there without clothes. A few hours go by, and he decides to end himself by drowning in the toilet. Well, in go about 8 cops in full gear. I would think 8 professional guards could move one guy, but they decided to taser him several times while his head is in a metal toilet and water. For 2 days, he just sat undressed on the floor, rocking back and forth with a blanket thrown over him. Then he just disappeared. First of all, tasering someone while their head is inside water? I will never understand how some guards get away with treating inmates this way. I'm also just scared to think too hard about where he might have disappeared off to. Coming in at number 4, ADX Florence. Located in Colorado, this supermax prison is dubbed by some as the Alcatraz of the Rockies and definitely has a few skeletons in its closet. One man in particular, named Harold Cunningham, in fact, was a part of a lawsuit against the penitentiary. Now, let's make one thing clear. You don't get into this prison unless you have committed some bad stuff. However, in Harold's case, what happened to him during his time at ADX only made matters worse. At first, Cunningham was sent to Marion and spent much of his time in the hole. However, he was prescribed medications that included antipsychotics due to a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, among other mental health disorders. Then, in 2001, he was transferred from Marion over to ADX and was denied his medications. This, of course, escalated his behavior and he became notorious for rule violations. But in his words, quote, "I was treated and lived like an animal for years, stripped of all my clothes for weeks at a time, just a blanket chained to my bed. Water turned off, no shower at times, no food, and when they did feed me, it was bad food, stale bread and cheese, rotten apples. I was beaten while handcuffed. All this on and off throughout 5 to 6 years. It was an up and down roller coaster ride in a bloody nightmare. I was at war physically and mentally. I survived, but now I suffer from PTSD, so it's hard for me to talk about some of the things I've been through." I mean, this man may not be innocent of his crimes, but the fact that they denied him prescribed medication and then kept adding on to his sentence for his behavior is wild to me. Coming in at number 3, Petsty Prison. Built in the late 1930s, this penal facility mainly housed political prisoners during the communist reign in Romania. But what made this prison beyond cruel compared to others was their bizarre methods of torture, particularly what they called the re-education experiments. These re-education experiments took place between 1949 to 1951, and their goal was to brainwash prisoners into giving up their religious and political beliefs to the extent of altering their personalities until they displayed complete and total obedience. In total, roughly 500 prisoners were victims to these re-education experiments, which were really just mandated forms of psychological and physical torture. The first stage, referred to as external unmasking, involved torture disguised as interrogation until inmates divulged everything, often confessing to crimes they didn't even commit just to make the torture stop. Next, the experiment began with what they called internal unmasking. The second stage forced prisoners into revealing the names of people who were lenient towards them during early interrogations. Then came the third and most brutal phase, known as public moral unmasking. The third phase involved public humiliation, usually in the form of coerced renouncing of their entire belief system. But it wasn't just forcing them to say something bad. One example of how they went forward with phase 3 involved dressing up Christians to look like Christ and turning them into forced blasphemy of sacred texts or religious symbols, going so far as to make them eat their own feces and call it Holy Communion. Thankfully, this chamber was closed down in 1952, and members of the experimental group were punished for their cruelties. Coming in our number 2 spot, the CIA. Back in 2014, it was publicly uncovered that the CIA had a program that was much more brutal than they had been inclined to let on. According to a document that was released called the Report, there was a very dark underbelly, much worse and with much less ineffective results than the CIA had previously let on. Many were detained under false pretenses, sometimes even by mistaken identity, and many were never a part of the hate groups the CIA claimed to be targeting. One man, Mohammed Ahmed al-Shouria Ben Soud, was brave enough to share his story. Soud was detained back in 2003 and said he was kidnapped from his home and remained in the facility for 16 months until he was released to a Libyan prison. Quote, "In my first interrogation shortly after having entered, I was brought in naked and stood there in the interrogation room. They removed the bag over my head. I found a female interrogator with the American intelligence saying to me in the harshest tone as she banged on the table, 'You are now a prisoner of the United States of America. You now have no rights.' Living conditions were hazardous. They lived in pitch black and were provided only with dirty water for drinking. But nothing compared to the inmates endured. There was a ring that hung from the ceiling that they would be hung from in different positions for hours on end while being required to stay awake or risk being beaten. Soud received broken bones and said that if you refused to talk, they would lock you inside a box until you suffocate from lack of oxygen and gave in. The list of the atrocities is practically endless, and I hope to God that exposing this facility forced some kind of regulation to these interrogations. And last up in our number 1 spot, the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum. Back in 1975, after their victory in the Cambodian Civil War, the Khmer regime commandeered what was once a high school in Phnom Penh into the notorious Security 21 prison. Encased in electrified barbed wire, the classrooms were converted into tiny prison cells and chambers where some of the most cruel and barbaric torture in history would take place. Between 1975 to the fall of Khmer Rouge in 1979, it's estimated 20,000 people were imprisoned at S21, and at least 18,000 of those inmates died while being tortured. The system at the facility was designed to make anyone confess to whatever crimes they were charged with by their captors, regardless of age, gender, or actual culpability. Victims of the prison were routinely beaten, given electric shocks, burned, and strangled, but it could be even worse. Those that didn't give in as easily would be slashed or even suffocated with plastic bags, and in some cases, they would even pull out fingernails and pour alcohol in the open wound or waterboard their prisoners. Plus, if you were a female, it was all too common for interrogators to take advantage of you. They then paired all this endless with forced sleep deprivation, and there was a medical unit where they would experiment and torture live inmates with no anesthesia. Thankfully, the cruel Khmer Rouge were defeated, and in 1980, the government reopened the building, having converted it into a memorial museum for the lives lost to these barbaric tortures.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Tommy Lynn Sells. Tommy Lynn Sells was an American serial killer who is responsible for 22 confirmed deaths, but authorities have said that they know there are more. I actually watched an interview that he did, and one of the aspects that scared me the most while watching him talk about his crimes is how you can tell that he committed these acts because he wanted to, and because he liked it. In the end, Tommy was caught because of someone who survived his attack in the most incredible way. She was able to go on and give such a good description of him that it led to his capture, and she was able to positively identify him. Not only did she save her own life, but who knows how many others. In the end, Tommy and his crimes were deemed so horrific that he received the death sentence and was executed on April 3rd, 2014. In our number 9 spot today, we have Sam Little. Sam Little is well known for being one of the worst serial killers ever. He has confessed to taking the lives of more than 90 people, and while authorities have only been able to definitively connect him to 30, they say they have no reason to doubt the validity of any of his other confessions. Sam was able to continue on his horrible path for so many years because of the fact that he committed these crimes in different states and different counties, which made it more difficult to connect these crimes to one another. In an interview with an investigator named Sergeant LeBlanc, as they discussed religious beliefs, they spoke about the nature of sin. Sam stated he had no fear of God and said that God made him this way, so why should he ask for forgiveness? He said that God knew everything he did. He also allegedly told a few select people that he believed he was the devil. In our number 8 spot today, we have Vincenzo Verzenni. Vincenzo lived from 1849 to 1918, and he was a serial killer who was nicknamed the Vampire of Bergamo. The first of his victims was found in 1870, and when authorities examined the body, they found bite marks on the neck, as well as certain parts of the body missing. The next of his victims he didn't end up taking the life of, but he tried to bite their neck. In 1872, there was the next body of one of his victims that was found, and it had all the strange and disturbing signs that the previous one had. After Vincenzo was arrested, he confessed to his crimes with the added detail that he also chose to drink the blood of his victims before leaving their bodies. Somehow, Vincenzo managed to escape the death penalty after a vote of sympathy from only one juror, and he instead was sentenced to life in an asylum. In our number 7 spot today, we have Daria Saltykova. Daria was a Russian noblewoman and serial killer from Moscow. She became well known for killing many of her serfs, mostly women. Because of her ties to the Russian royal court and other Russian nobility, complaints about the deaths at her estate were initially ignored and only resulted in punishments for those who did the complaining. Eventually, however, relatives of those who had been killed were able to bring a petition to Empress Catherine II, who then decided to try Daria publicly. Investigations took 6 long years, where the investigating official counted up to 138 suspicious deaths, basically all of which could likely be attributed to Daria. In the end, she was found guilty of 38 of these crimes, but the Empress wasn't quite sure what the punishment should be, as the death penalty had already been abolished in Russia. In the end, Daria was chained on a public platform and made to wear a sign around her neck that detailed the crimes she committed. After this form of punishment, she was sent to jail to serve out her life sentence. In our number 6 spot today, we have Herta Oberhauser. Herta was a German physician and convicted war criminal who performed absolutely horrific medical atrocities on prisoners at Ravensbrück Women's Concentration Camp. She was known for being a part of medical experiments like treating purposely infected wounds with sulfonamide, as well as bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration and transplantation. Herta was the only female that was a defendant in the Nuremberg doctor trials, and she was convicted for crimes against humanity, but was only sentenced to 20 years in prison. She was released early for good behavior and ended up becoming a family doctor again in West Germany. That was, however, until a survivor recognized her. Herta then had her medical license revoked, and then she was fined. She tried to appeal, but was rejected and never practiced medicine again. I think we can all probably be grateful for that. In our number 5 spot today, we have Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth was a Hungarian noblewoman who lived from August of 1560 to August of 1614. While she was born into one of the oldest and most powerful families in Transylvania and was well educated and successful, she also was killing young women and bathing in their blood. Okay, buried the lead on that one, sorry about that. Elizabeth has gone down as one of the most evil women in history because she was taking the lives of women who were her servants, and she was bathing in their blood because she believed it would keep her young. There's something that's telling me that it probably didn't work. Anyway, instead of being remembered as youthful and beautiful, Elizabeth is instead remembered as being a terrible, evil person who took the lives of somewhere from 175 to 200 women, but some accounts swear the number might be as high as 600. In our number 4 spot today, we have Charles Cullen. This guy used to be a nurse who took the lives of his patients throughout his career, and he may be one of the worst serial killers ever recorded. He confessed to taking the lives of 40 people, but through subsequent interviews, it became apparent that the number was way higher than 40. He just couldn't remember the names of them all. But he could, of course, remember the details of his crimes against them. His crimes started in 1988 and spanned over a decade into 2003. In October of 2003, when a patient at a hospital passed away from low blood sugar, the authorities were called. This person was Charles' final victim, and authorities began looking into him and investigating his past employment history. On December 12, 2003, authorities were arresting him and charging him with only 1 count of his crimes, but he ended up admitting to 40. He ended up pleading guilty to his crimes and arranged a plea deal where authorities would not seek the death penalty if he cooperated. During one of his court proceedings, he continuously asked the judge to step down and apparently repeatedly chanted, quote, "Your Honor, you need to step down," for 25 minutes straight, even after he was restrained and gagged for his outbursts. It is thought that his victims might be up in the 400 range, which is truly unbelievable. Charles was sentenced to 18 consecutive life sentences and will be eligible for parole in 2403. In our number 3 spot today, we have Charles Manson. While there are a ton of evil people on this list today, Charles is likely one of the most famous for the absolute worst reasons. Manson was released from prison in 1967, where he then moved to San Francisco, and that's where he gained a small following that would eventually go on to be the cult known as the Family. The group eventually moved to an abandoned ranch outside of Los Angeles, and it was here that Manson continued to brainwash his followers and manipulate them with his own religious philosophies. Manson claimed that there would be an upcoming race war in which white people would be killed, which was intended to instill fear in his followers. This was so that he could ignite a race war and send his followers on a killing spree, which did end up being the night of the horrible Tate and LaBianca killings. This led to a reign of terror in the Los Angeles area for several months because people just couldn't understand how or why this happened. In our number 2 spot today, we have Randy Kraft. Also known as the Scorecard Killer, Randy is a monster who took the lives of at least 16 young men between 1972 and 1983. The Scorecard nickname comes from how, after his arrest, police found a coded list that contained cryptic references to his crimes and the victims. On May 14, 1983, 2 California Highway Patrol officers observed a car driving erratically and suspected the driver may be impaired, so they pulled it over. Once the car pulled over, Randy Kraft got out and identified himself and subsequently failed all field sobriety tests. At the same time, the other officer went over to the passenger's side where he sadly found Randy's final victim, 25-year-old Marine Terry Lee Gambrell. The next 2 days of investigation revealed the horrors of what Kraft had done, and on May 16, 1983, he was formally charged with the one crime, but many more charges came in the next months. His trial first began on September 26, 1988, and on August 11, 1989, the jury rendered a verdict of death, and the sentence was upheld. As of this year, he still remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he continues to deny any responsibility for the crimes. Like they didn't find one of the victims in the passenger seat of his car. In our number 1 spot today, we have Peter Tobin. Peter Tobin is a serial killer who was convicted for 3 separate crimes, but it is believed his crimes may actually be up in the range of 40 to 50. Before being convicted of these crimes, Peter also served another 10-year prison sentence for other crimes committed, and he was released from prison for those crimes in 2004. 3 years later, however, he was sentenced to life with a minimum of 21 years for taking the life of Angelica Kluk in 2006. After this, remains of 2 more people who went missing in 1991 were found in his former home, and he was also tried for these crimes, which ended up solidifying his sentence to a whole life order, which means he will never be up for parole. There are some who believe Tobin is responsible for more unsolved crimes, and he has been labeled a psychopath by a senior psychologist. Apparently, while in prison, he has boasted about taking the lives of 48 people, despite the fact that he's only officially been linked to 3. So hopefully at some point we'll be able to actually confirm those other crimes that he's been talking about. Starting off our list, in our number 10 spot, we have Vicki Dawn Jackson. Vicki was a woman who worked as a nurse for a number of years. She first got her nursing license in 1989, but it wasn't until the 2000s when things took a seriously dark turn. Between December of 2000 and February of 2001, the hospital that Vicki was working for recorded a number of deaths that was unusual. It was a higher amount. Most of these patients were in the age range of 60 to 100 years old, and of course people just chalked this up to the advanced age of most of these patients, but a rumor began to spread that someone just might be responsible. After this, the hospital's administrator noticed that a vial of a drug called Mevacron had gone missing. You might see where I'm going with this. As it turns out, the person responsible was Nurse Vicki, and she had at least 10 patients whose lives she took by giving them too much of this missing drug. It was a muscle relaxant. Take in that this is 10 people between December and February. That is an unbelievable amount of people in a remarkably short amount of time. You might be wondering why she took these lives, and apparently she did it when she found these people rude, or quote, too demanding. In our number 9 spot today, we have Daniel Perez. Also known as Lou Castro, Daniel led a cult that was located on a 20-acre property in a rural area just north of Wichita. He convinced his followers that he had magical powers, and he told them all that that he was a centuries-old angel who needed to commit some horrific crimes in order to stay alive. These crimes would have certainly been more than enough to throw him on this list, but he of course couldn't just stop at committing one type of crime. He had to make sure he really stole the show on just being the worst. Basically, he had the really clever idea to use his followers' life insurance policies to live a lavish lifestyle, like as if no one would think that's weird or suspicious. While some of these life insurance policies were collected through regular means, of course that kind of greed only leads to evil things, which of course means that he ended up taking one of his followers' lives so that he could collect the cash. It is thought that he also contributed to the deaths of some of the other people's life insurance policies he cashed in on, but unfortunately there was never any evidence that would be able to substantiate that claim. Despite this, however, on April 21st, 2010, authorities were able to arrest Daniel, and he was charged with 28 felonies. In February of 2015, he was convicted on all counts and received a sentence of 80 years in jail, where he remains. In our number 8 spot today, we have Chester Turner. Chester is an American serial killer who, on April 30th, 2007, was convicted of taking the lives of 11 women in the Los Angeles area, and on June 19th, 2014, he was convicted of 4 more that they were able to tie back to him. He has been referred to by prosecutors as one of the most prolific serial killers in the city's history, and if you know Los Angeles' history, that says a lot. In his original trial that led to his conviction, Chester was sentenced to death, but at the following one in 2014, he also received an additional death sentence. In the end, like with a lot of these kinds of stories, DNA came to save the day and help authorities find out who was committing these horrible, horrible crimes. In our number 7 spot today, we have Michael Bear Carson and Susan Carson. This couple is not one that anyone would want to encounter. The stories of these two come from the 80s. They were married, and on the outside they appeared like just a couple of harmless hippies. We all know not to judge a book by its cover though. In the end, they would go on to become known as the San Francisco Witch Killers. Didn't know San Francisco had so many witches running around. Basically, together the pair took the lives of 3 separate people between 1981 and 1983. They started off by killing their roommate, who Susan claimed was a witch, and said that she was stealing her quote health, power, and beauty. They next killed one guy that they worked on a farm with because they said he was a demon, and the final person they took the life of unfortunately picked up the pair as they were hitchhiking, and they took his life because they claimed that he was a quote black witch, whatever that means. Essentially, they were just committing crimes against people that they claimed to be witches. The pair were each tried and convicted for each separate crime and are both serving sentences of 75 years to life, and of course neither of them have shown any kind of remorse for what they've done. In our number 6 spot today, we have Samuel Dieteman. Samuel is just one half of the pair known as the serial shooters. He, along with a man named Dale, were actively committing these crimes between May of 2005 and August of 2006, and basically they were arsonists who would randomly set fire to objects, but they would also drive around and commit random acts of violence, taking people's lives. In the end, a series of tips is what led investigators to identify the perpetrators of these horrible crimes, in particular one from a friend of Samuel who explained that Sam had actually confessed to some of the killings one night while drinking. In Dale's trial, he was sentenced to death 6 times, and his brother, who was later found out to have assisted in some of the crimes, was sentenced to 25 years. Samuel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dale ended up taking his own life while on death row, which is why this point mainly focuses on Samuel, who remains in prison. In our number 5 spot today, we have Keith Hunter Jesperson, also known as the Happy Face Killer. After the body of his first victim was found, Keith had someone else actually claim to be responsible for his crime. You would think that this would have been his ideal scenario, but that was not the case. He wanted to be known for his crimes. So, to help himself get media attention, he drew a smiley face on a bathroom wall hundreds of miles away from his crime scene, and here he left an anonymous letter where he confessed to the crime and provided proof. He didn't end up receiving a reply, so he decided to write more letters to the media and to the authorities, each signed with a smiley face. In the end, Keith was initially caught after he became the prime suspect in the death of his girlfriend at the time. Previously, his victims had been people that he had no connection to, so this was truly the mistake the authorities needed to catch him. Keith then admitted to his crimes, and while he has formally been linked to 8 deaths, he has confessed to somewhere around 185. Keith was tried and sentenced to life without parole for his heinous crimes, and he remains in prison at Oregon State Penitentiary. In our number 4 spot today, we have Quincy Allen. Quincy Allen is a man who went went on a crime spree between July and August of 2002, where he took the lives of 4 people. His crime spree was actually inspired while he was in prison serving time for stealing a vehicle. It was here that a fellow inmate decided to start recruiting others and told him that he could get him a job as a mafia hitman, and this is all that Quincy needed to be inspired. As soon as he was out of prison, he began practicing for his new, upcoming career. Quincy started off his horrific crime spree on July 7th, 2002 by attacking a 51-year-old homeless man who was sleeping at the time. Luckily, this man was able to survive this attack. His crimes continued until he was arrested on August 14th, 2002. After his arrest and trial, Quincy received a sentence of death and is still on death row awaiting execution. His sentencing did not deter him from the criminal life, however, as in 2009, Quincy, along with another inmate, planned an attack on a correctional officer at the prison they both reside at. In the end, the guards had to use rubber bullets to subdue the pair. Quincy was intended to be executed on January 8th, 2010, but there was a stay of execution that was accepted, and as of July 26, 2022, Quincy's death sentence was overturned. In our number 3 spot today, we have David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, or the Son of Sam, is an American serial killer who terrorized New York from July of 1976 to July of 1977. He took the lives of 6 people and wounded 7 others, all while eluding the biggest manhunt in New York City history. He was one of those really arrogant ones who leaves the little notes for police promising to do it again, kind of like taunting them. Well, his arrogant self was caught for his crimes and he was arrested on August 10th, 1977, and he was indicted. He confessed to all of his crimes and claimed that he was just obeying the orders of a demon that had manifested itself in the form of a dog that belonged to his neighbor. Okay. Sure. He was found mentally competent to stand trial, and he pleaded guilty to his crimes, which left him sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. He later admitted to making up the dog story, which we know, but he did say that instead he was a member of a violent satanic cult and his crimes were committed as a part of that. These claims were investigated, but no one has ever been able to confirm or deny these claims. In our number 2 spot today, we have Sean Great. Sean is a serial killer who committed a series of crimes from 2006 until he was apprehended in 2016. Throughout his decade of criminal activity, it is thought that he took the lives of at least 5 people. In September 2016, Sean was arrested and later indicted for 2 killings, as well as kidnapping and harming a woman whose 911 call actually led to his arrest. At the same time, in another county next door, he was also being charged with 2 other deaths, as well as another one from all the way back in 2006. This final count from all of those years ago was actually an unsolved Jane Doe case who had been unidentified for 12 years. When Sean confessed to this crime, he wasn't even sure who she was, he just said that he believed her name was Dana. On May 7th, 2018, Sean was convicted on 2 of the counts, and on March 1st, 2019, he pleaded guilty to 2 of the others, and on September 11th, 2019, he pleaded guilty to an additional count. In the end, he was sentenced to death and has remained on death row since that final plea and sentencing, and he is currently scheduled to be executed in 2025. In a very bittersweet turn of events, in June of 2019, that Jane Doe victim was finally able to be identified through the DNA Doe Project, and she was identified as 23-year-old Dana Nicole Lowry from Minden, Louisiana. It definitely can't bring her back, but there is a lot of comfort in knowing that her family finally received some answers. In our number 1 spot today, we have Glenn Stewart Godwin. In 1980, Glenn was working in California and wasn't really living a life of crime, so it's pretty surprising that in this year, he and his roommate decided to make a plan to rob someone they knew who was once a friend of theirs. Of course, things go awry and it turns into a botched robbery, and Glenn ends up taking the life of the person they were robbing. They then tried to blow up the crime scene to get rid of any evidence, but of course that didn't work and also just made them look even more insane. Both Glenn and his roommate were both tried and convicted for the crimes in 1983. This is not where the story ends. In 1987, Glenn tried to escape prison and failed, and this landed him at a higher security prison. At this new prison, he attempted escape again, and this time, he was actually successful. He fled to Mexico, where he tried, unsuccessfully, to be a part of the illegal drug trade. He was arrested again and sentenced in Mexico, and this is when American authorities began the process of getting him extradited. During this process, Glenn decided that it would be a brilliant idea to take the life of an inmate who was a member of the Mexican cartel, which very obviously slowed the process of extradition. This gave him time to plan another escape, which he did in 1991. And since then, he's been on the run.
At number 10 is Jose Antonio Acosta Hernandez, aka El Diego. If evil is a measure of your body count, then Jose here tops the leaderboards. El Diego is the former leader of La Línea, the leading faction of the Juarez cartel. Originally established as a team of heavily armed ex and active duty police officers, this unit has evolved into the enforcement arm of the cartel, safeguarding narcotics traffickers from the criminal underworld. In 2012, Hernandez himself was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences, plus an additional 20 years for his involvement in a litany of crimes including racketeering, narcotics trafficking, money laundering, and of course the Big M. And that M is big indeed, as Hernandez has confessed to orchestrating or partaking in over 1,500 unalivings between 2008 and 2012 alone. Hernandez finds himself serving not 1, not 2, but 3 consecutive life sentences plus an additional 20 years. His new permanent home is the ominous and supremely fortified confines of the ADX Florence Supermax facility, touted as the most secure correctional facility on the planet, even above maximum security prisons. Here Hernandez resides in solitary confinement, as do all prisoners at ADX Florence, where he'll spend the rest of his days sitting with the consequences of his malevolent actions. If you're enjoying the video so far, you can support the channel by pressing the like button, subscribing to Most Amazing Top 10, and ringing that notification bell. Those who do can rest easy knowing that they're nowhere near as evil as number 9, Terry Nicholas. Terry Nicholas, American domestic terrorist, infamous for his role in 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. Born on April 1st, 1995, Nicholas had an array of short-term jobs from farming to real estate before a fateful encounter with Timothy McVeigh during a stint in the US Army. The alliance culminated in the tragedy of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building on April 19, 1995, claiming 186 lives. In 1997, Nicholas was found guilty in a federal trial on charges including conspiracy to use weapon of mass destruction and involuntary man unaliving, which stemmed from the tragic demise of federal law enforcement personnel. Although the plaintiff sought the capital punishment, aka the unalive penalty, the jury couldn't reach a consensus, and so instead he served a life sentence without parole. He also faced state charges during yet another trial in Oklahoma, where he was convicted of a staggering 161 counts of first-degree unaliving, arson, and conspiracy, but yet again the state jury was unable to decide on whether to impose capital punishment. As a result, he's serving 161 consecutive life sentences at ADX Florence in Colorado. On the other hand, his co-conspirator Timothy McVeigh, who planned and carried out the whole wasn't so lucky. McVeigh was executed in 2001. At number 8 is Luis Felipe, aka King Blood. Hailing from Havana, Cuba, Felipe made his way to the United States during the Mariel boat lift of 1990, an event famously depicted in Scarface. Among the so-called undesirables sent to the US was Luis Felipe, who would end up in Chicago where he would first come into contact with the notorious Latin King street gang. Fast forward to 1986 and he moved to the Big Apple, where he founded the New York chapter of the Latin Kings. But eventually Luis Felipe was arrested on unaliving charges after he unalived his girlfriend while under the influence, serving 9 years at the Collins Correctional Facility in New York, but the tale only gets darker from here. See, in 95, he found himself convicted of orchestrating multiple unalivings from behind bars, penning the orders to fellow Latin kings on the outside. This led to his sentencing of life imprisonment, plus an additional 45 years served in strict solitary confinement with absolutely zero communication with the outside world. Currently, King Blood resides in the notorious ADX Florence. At number 7 is Caboni Savage, whose name isn't just fitting, it's an understatement. Emerging as a dealer in Hunting Park, Savage ascended to become a kingpin, orchestrating the distribution of vast quantities of nose powder throughout North Philadelphia from 98 to 04. Savage's malevolence escalated when he was accused of personally slaying a stranger. Notably, he even ordered hits on competitors and adversaries, including orchestrating the demise of a rival dealer, Carlton Brown. His ruthless grip extended to intimidation, with threats aimed at witnesses' families, but unfortunately those threats turned out to be promises. Enter Eugene Twin Coleman, once in cahoots with Savage, who testified against Savage in a narcotics trial, leading to Savage's conviction. Savage retaliated by orchestrating the arson of Marcella Coleman's house, and the claimed 6 lives. Caboni Savage ended up receiving 13 consecutive unaliving sentences, while Lewis was only given a 40-year sentence on account of the stark differences on the level of remorsefulness displayed during their testimonies. At number 6 is Daria Nikolvania Saltykova, commonly known as Saltychika. Born into a rich Russian noble family in the year 1730, Saltykova lived alone in her estate after the passing of her husband. You see, Saltykova had some serious connections in high places, rubbing elbows with the powerfully elite, but eventually the persistence of victims' relatives caught the attention of none other than Empress Catherine II. Saltykova was arrested and held for 6 years while authorities held a painstaking investigation which counted as many as 138 suspicious unalivings. After a public trial, Saltykova was found guilty of ending the lives of at least 38 female serfs through brutal beatings and torture. Eventually, she was sentenced to life imprisoned in Moscow, where she spent the first 11 out of 33 years chained in a basement dungeon without a window and only given a candle during meals. And number 5 is Robert Maudsley, aka Hannibal Lecter. The longest-serving British prisoner in solitary confinement, had a troubled youth marked by violence claimed to be his father. In the 1960s, he turned to night walking due to substance addiction and sought psychiatric help after attempting self-harm, citing disturbing voices in his head which urged him to assassinate his parents. He said that if he had, he would have never committed any of his future unalivings. In 1974, he strangled John Farrell, who had shown Maudsley pictures of his kidnapped victims. He turned himself in, leading to his institutionalization at Broadmoor Hospital. In 1977, Maudsley and another inmate brutally tortured and eliminated another inmate, resulting in another conviction and transferred to Wakefield Prison, where he brutally attacked and offed 2 fellow inmates, displaying extreme violence and earning him the nickname Hannibal the Anthropophage, because that's better somehow. Deemed far too dangerous, Maudsley occupies a 2-cell basement unit and is always escorted by 4 officers outside of his cell. At number 4 is James Marcello, aka Little Jimmy, aka Jimmy Light, aka Jimmy the Man. In April 2005, the spotlight shone on front boss of the Chicago outfit and his half-brother, Michael Mickey Marcello, as they face charges for racketeering, conspiracy, loan sharking, running illegal gambling schemes, and 18 separate counts of unaliving people. Marcello's bid for freedom saw him offering a staggering $12.5 million worth of homes and bond collateral, a desperate attempt thwarted by the US District Judge. The former boss is now serving a life sentence in solitary at, you guessed it, the ADX Florida Supermax facility. Speaking of which, number 3 is Thomas Silverstein, America's most isolated man. This dude just can't seem to stop offing people. Thomas Silverstein's life in prison began at 19 for armed robbery, and he was sent to San Quentin. After some more crimes, he landed in Leavenworth, Kansas with a 15-year sentence, and in 1980 he earned a life sentence for eliminating an inmate who wouldn't be a pawn in his substance distribution scheme. He moved to USP Marion, enduring extreme solitary confinement, but nevertheless he was accused of another murder in 81 and got another life sentence, leading to his feud with rival gang member Raymond Lee Cadillac Smith, who he also eventually assassinated as the guards did nothing to keep the two apart. Then after that he orchestrated a guard's assassination and faced more life sentences. The guard's assassination served as the final straw, leading to a 23-year lockdown at the prison and inspiring a whole new prison design. Silverstein spent 36 years in solitary there, passing away as the longest held prisoner in the Bureau of Prisons. Dzhokhan Tsarnaver, who along with his brother Tamerlan orchestrated the infamous and devastating Boston Marathon. The brothers placed pressure cooker near the finish line, causing 3 people to lose their lives and astounding 281 others to be injured in the aftermath. Just 3 days later, after their faces were revealed to the public thanks to CCTV footage, they fatally assassinated MIT police officer Sean Collier, not because they were identified, but because they wanted to steal his firearm. Then they hijacked an SUV and engaged in a wild with the police, even throwing at them. As Dzhokhar was trying to escape law enforcement, he drove over his own brother, dragging him under the stolen SUV about 30 feet. His brother didn't survive, and Dzhokhar abandoned the SUV and vanished on foot into the night, triggering an unprecedented manhunt of epic proportions. He was eventually discovered hiding in a boat in a Watertown backyard not far from where he had ditched the SUV. Inside the boat, scribbled on the cabin wall with a pen, the bomber left a note claiming the responsibility for the marathon attack, citing vengeance for US military actions in Afghanistan and Iraq. It coldly referred to the innocent victims as collateral damage, drawing eerie parallels to the casualties of war. He even expressed complete lack of remorse for having unalived his own brother. Ultimately, justice caught up with Tsarnaver. He faced trial where he's convicted of a staggering 30 counts, and his fate was sealed with a sentence of capital punishment. At number 1 is Clara Homolka, who gets the top spot for being Canadian. Sure doesn't make me proud. Back in the late 1990s, Clara Homolka and her partner in crime, Paul Bernardo, engaged in some truly heinous acts, responsible for the demise of not 1, not 2, but 3 innocent women, one of whom happened to be Clara's own sister, Tammy. Now, once her co-conspirator got nabbed by the authorities in '83, Clara decided to switch gears and claim that she was actually dragged into this nightmare against her will, painting herself as the unwilling accomplice. She then struck a deal that landed her a relatively lenient sentence of 12 years, and all she had to do was spill the beans on Paul. Jump back to the year 2007, and guess who's back on the streets? That's right, you guys, she didn't need to escape prison because, well, they let her out onto the streets willy-nilly. That's right, Homolka, now a mom of 2 and remarried, and get this, she's volunteering at a school in Montreal. Parents everywhere were like, hold up, are we seriously gonna let a former serial unaliver be around our miniature clones? Well, that was quite the unsettling journey through the lives of those who find themselves eternally secluded from the outside world.
And we're starting off this list with the Pottawatomie County Jail located in Council Bluffs, Iowa. It was built in 1885 and is known as the squirrel cage, or at least it used to be, due to its unique design. Instead of traditional cells, the jail featured a rotating circular cage. The design was kind of revolutionary for the time. It was intended to increase security and allow for better surveillance of the inmates, but was ultimately discontinued due to its impracticality. Some prisoners were also severely harmed in the rotating contraption. So basically there was these cylindrical cages that prisoners' cells were located in. They each had one opening, and the jailer turned his crank and the cell would rotate to either face the opening or the enclosed part of the cage. It was pretty dangerous, and a lot of prisoners lost limbs. So yeah, not a place you would have wanted to end up in. Despite being decommissioned in 1969, many people believe that this county jail is haunted. The former jail was also featured in Ghost Adventures, so if you want to learn more about it, you can check that episode out. At number 9, we have the Orleans Parish Prison. Orleans Parish Prison, located in New Orleans, Louisiana, is regarded as one of the worst prisons in the United States and was one of the most heavily impacted facilities during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The prison has a violent reputation and has been scrutinized for being understaffed, filthy. Probably the most infamous incident at the prison, though, took place during Hurricane Katrina. Roughly 650 prisoners were left behind in the prison after the hurricane hit, and the conditions inside quickly deteriorated. Of course, as the floodwaters rose and power was lost, many inmates were left without food, water, basic necessities, and some were forced to drink from toilets in order to survive. It's believed that over 500 prisoners lost their lives. The State Correctional Institution, also known as Western Penitentiary in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This former prison has been left abandoned since 2017 and is known for a particularly dark incident that took place in 1987. A fire broke out in one of the prison's cell blocks, causing significant damage and endangering the lives of inmates and staff. That's what fire does. It's dangerous. It was later revealed, though, that the fire had been deliberately started by a group of guards in response to a protest by inmates. The incident happened when a group of inmates began protesting poor conditions and mistreatment at the facility, including overcrowding and limited access to basic necessities. In response, a group of guards reportedly entered the cell block and set fire to a pile of garbage, causing the blaze to quickly spread throughout the area. Inmates were left trapped in their cells, and smoke and flames engulfed the block. Many suffered smoke inhalation and other injuries as a result.